This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Jessica Millward, who teaches in the departments of History and of African American Studies at University of California, Irvine. Along with numerous scholarly and public-facing pieces, she is the author of Finding Charity's Folk, Enslaved and Free Black Women in Maryland from 2015. In this conversation, we discuss race and gender, archival work, and the complex task of writing African American women's history in a Black studies context. Good morning, Jessica. How are you today?
Good morning, John. I'm doing very well. How are you doing on your side of the country?
I'm doing just fine. We're in the middle of a heat wave already, I think the third major heat wave, so I'm sure it's going to be an uncomfortable summer. But I'm sitting up in an air-conditioned home office and having a chance to talk with you on the podcast today, which I'm very excited about. I think your research is very interesting. You also, done research and writing on Maryland, so there's a nice kind of synergy there with University of Maryland, which is our home base in the podcast. But mostly, I just think this is going to be a really fantastic contribution to the series, and I really appreciate your time and appreciate your thoughtfulness. So welcome to the Black Studies Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So we'll have a chance to talk about your research, how you imagine the field of Black studies, and how you think about these things together. But I wanted to start off with a more personal question and ask you, what is it that drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life? And what keeps you connected to and sustains you in relation to this kind of work?
I've anticipated this question, and I think my answer is so very boring compared to other people that have been on the podcast. It's just
we'll be the judge of that.
My trajectory is really boring. I was raised in, of all places, Salt Lake City, Utah, the hard streets of Salt Lake City, Utah. Quotation around hard because, it's Salt Lake City, Utah. What happens there? I attended the University of Utah, and I was a history major and an African American Studies minor. They had such a thing at the University of Utah. And two of the things that were very important to African American studies at my undergrad institution was interacting with the community. One of the professors, Reverend France Davis, was also pastor of the local Baptist church, one of the biggest Baptist churches in Salt Lake City. Wilfred Samuels, the English professor, who's very well known for his work on Toni Morrison, was one of my professors. And then Ronald Coleman, who was a historian of African Americans and the Mormon Church. So all of these things combined in the African American Studies program and kind of in some ways taught me that you need to be visible to the community, you need to understand history, and then in the case of the late Wilfred Samuels, you have to do it with a flair. You have to do it with a flair. You have to do it with a way that captures audiences, and you have to do it in a way that's intellectually engaging. So I did undergrad at the University of Utah, and then I applied for, let me back up. This is the most exciting part. In the course of being an undergraduate African American Studies minor, of course, I came in contact with Angela Davis's work and her autobiography. And at the same time, I was applying to grad school. And so I can't even tell you that I have an interesting moment of saying I'm going to UCLA because they have one of the top African American Studies programs or one of the longest African American Studies programs. I was intrigued by this university system that would be silly enough to fire Angela Davis. And so in applying to UCLA, I always had this in the back of my mind, like, what is this UC system? What is this institution? The fact that I ended up, loving the University of California system and taking a job here is neither here nor there. Another shout out to UCLA for those people who did their MA there or their PhD there or even their undergrad there. It has a very interesting relationship with the Black Panthers, the US organization, and, literally some of the battles of terrain being fought on the steps of Campbell Hall. So I also come to Black studies with kind of a reverence for Black life, as a result of being at UCLA. And then, what happens? I then went on to do a PhD in history at UCLA, but always had my foot in African American studies, not just because they're just separated by two buildings and a sidewalk, but really because, especially at UCLA at a time, the master's degree was a great kind of catalyst for a lot of scholars that wanted to do a PhD work.
Wow.
At the time I was there, Valerie Smith was there, Richard Yarbrough was there. I mean, it was just a really dynamic time. And it was actually also following Prop 209, the passage of Prop 209, that is, one of these long-term, enduring, frustrating legacies of affirmative action or not affirmative action in the UC system. So it was a time when faculty, particularly in Black studies, really rallied around the students, regardless of their major, and made sure that we were taken care of, both in undergrad studies and in grad studies. So that is, that occupied about 10 whole years of my life. And then I eventually, my first postdoc was at the University of Illinois in African American Studies. And then later that translated into a job in African American Studies and History at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And that was also a wonderful time to be there. It was a wonderful time to be there. We had a lot of scholars, some of whom have been on this podcast, but there were a lot of young Black scholars, a lot of young Black people doing Black studies. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot from not just the discipline, but how to wade in institutional waters when maybe Black studies isn't celebrated or maybe it's under attack. And most importantly, I learned how to build a Black studies department from being at University of Illinois. And I think lastly, throughout my intellectual journey, I've always really been concerned with this question of not just enslavement. I was introduced to the life of enslaved women and enslaved women as a research topic when I did my MA thesis at UCLA under Brenda Stevenson. I looked at Black women and acts of infanticide. But from that, I have always had a question of how did we survive? How did we excise moments of, if you could call it joy or autonomy or freedom from the most impossible circumstances? So that kind of drives my work always in the back of my mind. I tell my undergrads that African American Studies as a discipline, as a major, as a minor, is some of the hardest work you will do, but it's in some ways the most rewarding because you can learn so much about how to keep tradition, what is involved in building, what is involved in maintaining, and most importantly, it's okay to celebrate when you have some victories. I think many times in the academy, you're supposed to be, what do we call it? The humble brag.
Yeah.
Let's not even do the humble brag. Celebrate that your book got an award. We get so few moments in academia in particular, and probably the Black experience in general, where we're allowed to celebrate accomplishments. So that's a long way of saying from undergrad to University of Illinois, graduate University of Illinois, to now I'm at UC Irvine. I like to say I'm at UC Irvine, the house that Afro-pessimism built, as Frank Wilderson is on the faculty. And I arrived at UC Irvine with a position in the history department. I only wanted a 100% appointment because at Illinois I'd had a joint appointment, and it can be a lot. So I arrived, and probably for the first 10 or so years was in the history department. And one of my colleagues, who will remain nameless, we talked a lot about some of the challenges about being in a history department, and they pointed out, "You've been in a history department your entire time at Irvine." I said, "You know what? You're right." So I started interacting more with African American studies. I'm still wasn't ready for a joint appointment, but I signed on as first a 0 point appointment, and now I'm a core faculty member because one of the things I realized is that I was I was not intellectually satisfied with
Hmm.
only teaching the Black experience from a history standpoint and only teaching students that were interested in history in terms of this is what the source says. This is how I can write a paper. I wanted students that felt emotionally attached to the subject matter and had a stake in the subject matter. So, about 5 years ago, I signed on as a core member of African American Studies at UC Irvine. And, you know, I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying it. I missed what it was like to be able to be in a discipline where I'm not so I don't wanna let me back up. I love history as a discipline. I love African American studies as a discipline, but it is 2 different kinds of teaching, um, and especially in a space like UC Irvine that is so conservative. So students who come into undergrad as history majors, they have a thought about what history is and what history isn't, and I've decided, I'm not gonna fight that battle. Let me also teach, African American history to 1865 and teach it the way I want to teach it with film, with song, with, anything can be a source. So I feel that African American studies as a discipline, as much as it is a formal discipline, it also gives you freedom that you don't have in some more conservative disciplines. That's a whole lot of discipline conversation. The discipline of the discipline of the discipline. It's just more open and freeing than some of the other, disciplines. I mean, you can talk to anyone. That's why we put our lines in African American studies. That's why we like being in African American studies, Africana studies, or Black studies is because there is a freedom that sometimes these more, trying to think of a word besides discipline, but you know what I mean, the field of African American studies is much more liberating.
Mhm, mhm. I had a couple of things I wanted to ask you about. First of all, that's not boring at all, so, I'll just announce that at the beginning. Um, but I'm interested, you mentioned was it Campbell Hall at UCLA?
Yes.
Yeah. Was that something that you knew about UCLA and Black studies, or is it to sort of have a public, expression of that? I'm really interested because I'm asking because I think so much about my own department and my former department at Amherst College, my department here at University of Maryland. We have so little representation, if at all, of the history of our departments. And the founding of these departments come at such great risk and sacrifice by 18 to 22-year-olds. And
Mhm.
so I think in some ways that's a failure of memorialization that deserves, memory that deserves to be present, but also part of the, as you said, it was like meant something to like come to this hall and to think, this is where all these things converge to make Black studies at UCLA possible.
Mhm.
I mean, was that your knowledge, or is that actually announced at the hall?
Um, it's both. It's both. So originally, African American Studies was in Haynes Hall. I think it still is. The steps at Candle Hall is where the Black Panther members were gunned down, Bunchy Carter and John
Oh, okay,
Huggins.
okay.
So it's not so much the discipline and the department was forged there, but it's forged there in that environment.
Got it.
Um, and I think it's either part of a tour or people are told this. It's something you just know. If you haven't done the reading, on the Black Power struggle and the Black Panthers, you might not know, but it is something that you know by the time you leave UCLA as a Black student. And so there's not a plaque, there's not anything like that. But it's just something that these steps are very
Got it.
important for the Black liberation movement. And yeah, and in terms of how the department came to be, it was like 20 or 30 years of struggle. I think the program itself was established in the late 70s by Claudia Mitchell Kernan and Belinda Tucker, who are also great mentors and individuals and, kind of institution builders at UCLA. They were among some of the first to start the African American Studies program, and then under my former dissertation advisor, now colleague Brenda Stevenson, the steps were put in place to make it a department. And I think it finally became a department when the late Mark Sawyer was chair. He's unfortunately passed away. So it became a department in terms of its history quite recently. A long time ago now for me, but quite recently in terms of it took, like so many things in institutions, decades to establish.
Yeah.
But so I don't think that many people, and certainly some junior faculty, might not know the history of just how long it takes to get some of these places established as departments.
Yeah, yeah. Also wanted to follow up to go back to the very beginning of what you were talking about and ask, you know, you started with that moment of discovering African American history and African American studies minor and the mentors in that at University of Utah. I'm interested in how that related to your sort of life and education prior to that. I mean, was it something like an experience of like a total absence and gap that had a little bit of anxiety or whatever, a little bit of frustration that then this college classroom sort of finally gave expression to? Or did you grow up with a curriculum that touched on these and it was able to then develop and flourish in the proper kind of way in college? I mean, look, I was born in Los Angeles, but I grew up in Boise, so I know this sort of Mountain
Oh,
West
okay.
thing. So I kind of already know the answer, but I can't fill in the blanks for you. And you can always surprise me with the progressive, Salt Lake City curriculum if you want to shock me. But
I'm not going to shock you. There wasn't a progressive African American studies curriculum. I'm sure you're astounded. In the 1980s, there was not a progressive African American studies curriculum. It's the fact that African American studies is a discipline I discovered as undergrad, but in terms of certain things, certain kind of cultural themes in terms of, being isolated, being minimized, I think that I don't want this to be a therapy session, so I'm just gonna say, yeah, this is something in terms of the discipline I discovered at the college. It was interesting that all my mentors, except for one at university, were, men, and now I do Black feminist studies, so that's the turn. But, yeah, I was raised in Salt Lake City, Utah. Uh, this is out there, so I might as well put it out here too. It's not like it is secret. Raised by Mormon parents, so add that level of race and difference into the conversation. And so I always was wondering, like, what is my place, especially as a Black person, a biracial person in the LDS Church. My life didn't make sense,
mhm.
and I'm still in this quandary, like. Spiritually, I don't think God makes mistakes, but my life doesn't make sense in this framing. And so when I, was in college and I was exposed to more worldviews, I'm like, oh, my life is starting to make a bit more sense now.
Mhm, mhm,
So, I've always had the existential crisis, like, what am I doing here and why was I placed here?
mhm,
And it's interesting how life goes full circle because I really believe that part of my mission as a scholar is to shine light back into the past and to write in the place of people who felt that they wouldn't be remembered,
mhm,
or knew they wouldn't be remembered. So I think that also plays into how I am as a scholar. I look for these tiny little cracks. I don't look for the well-known stories. It would be so much easier if I did. But I look for these tiny little cracks of people that are waiting to have their story be told, that they're literally crying from the past, crying from the archive, and they want their story told. And, I also deal with what I call the ghosts of slavery, which are they can be rhetorical ghosts, or those of us who really deal with slavery know they can be very real ghosts. And your subject matter will sometimes let you know what can be told and what can't be told.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Sometimes there is a block. There's a block in terms of research or in your own kind of mind and putting the pieces together. And sometimes that you have to work around. And sometimes the block is because we're just not supposed to know this information yet.
Mm-hmm.
So that went a little deeper than than you thought it would. But I think that there is a relationship to kind of how I was raised on the margins and where I'm finding celebration of Black life, also in the margins, also in non-traditional spaces.
Thank you for that. This very interesting amount. I think one of the sort of threads that pulls so many of these podcast episodes together, especially this sort of opening part of the conversation, is the role of a Black Studies classroom, or sometimes even just a single class or text that
Mhm.
pulls together things. And what it pulls together is not necessarily pulling together, a bunch of existing knowledge, but the yearnings and gaps and absences. And so I love the way you told that as a way of animating your very approach to history. I mean, as you said, it's more difficult to find the stories that are crying out to be told, but quietly, or maybe even withholding. And so, um, yeah. That I'm glad I followed up, because that brings together so many really, really interesting things, not only about you and your path into this field, but also in terms of how we come to our investments in the kind of work that we do. So thank you for that.
Thank you for asking.
So let me ask you then about Black studies as a field. Like, what's that portrait for you? Like, how do you imagine the field of Black studies? And I always ask this in the context of its founding, which had its origins in a commitment that we inherit today as a commitment to intellectual life, that students had demanded that there be a place to study the history, culture, literature, sociology, etc., of Black life. That traditional disciplines had not done this work. And so Black Studies was going to be, and then has been, that place on campuses. But of course, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when Black Studies was established at universities, this was a moment where the radicalization of Black liberation struggle had really contested those boundaries between classrooms and communities, between ideas and mobilization, between books and prescriptive action. And so I think we inherit that in terms of political commitment in Black studies to a certain kind of Black liberation struggle. And so I'm interested sort of in that context, but also open-ended, how you imagine the field of Black studies. What's that portrait that orients you?
I've thought about this question a lot leading up to this podcast, and part of my answer is a very institutional, buttoned up. Black studies is a traditional discipline. People don't realize that it comes from a history, either a history of activism, a history of, in some ways, just what you said, student protest. And also, there's canonical texts that, I think people should read. Anything from Frantz Fanon to going back to UCLA and the work of Robert Hill. He always used the example of his mentor, Sinclair Drake, Black folk here and there. There's just some canonical texts that I think that it would behoove younger scholars to read. I think that one of the most important people we lost in the field of Black women's history, for example, is my dear Rosalind Turberg Penn, who was a mentor, and she always used the example of, she was a historian. Footnotes. We need to know the footnotes. We need to know the literature. We need to know the dialogue. Who was talking with whom? And I try to teach my students that, Black studies, as much as it has a base and there's a need to connect with the community, there's also intellectual questions that are taking place. It can be the intellectual questions in terms of elitism and more, everyday people. It can be intellectual questions that really, what is the university's role to the community? Should we be in these silos of the ivory tower, or should there be some interaction with the community? And I think that's also a tension right now in the field. Well, it's always been a tension in terms of once you institutionalize Black studies and people's job is dependent on books and the press they publish with and the reach in terms of, who they're writing for, sometimes it lines up that, a trade book or a book that with larger appeal works for tenure and promotion. And sometimes in some people's institutions, it doesn't line up that way. So I think we're in this moment of Black studies really trying to figure out what the best venue is. And I think your podcast is a great example of this, in that Black studies can be a book, it can be a podcast, it can be doing oral histories as a community member. I think there's a lot of ways in which the archive of Black studies is evolving, right? So that was kind of a convoluted answer. I imagine the field of Black studies right now to be very expansive, very expansive, in that, you can become an architect of your own archive. Some historians think, oh, can you really do that? But we're in this social media moment where, Black Lives Matter protests are, it's crazy to imagine that there's already been books published on 2020, right? Because as historians, books take so long. But, I think that the Black Lives Matter movement is a perfect example how you can mesh kind of what is going on with the real world with the actual intellectual tradition and obligation we have to talk about the way in which understanding Black life and the contributions of Black life are really important. And to that end, as I imagine/witness what is happening to the Black studies legacy on campuses, not so much the Black intellectual tradition, because I don't think you can ever mute that. There's always going to be someone talking, writing, singing, rapping, talking about these spaces of contestation. But in terms of the intellectual life on campuses, we are at this moment. We're at the post George Floyd moment where Black people are no longer cachet. We're in the second presidency of a person who does not believe there's any kind of merit in Black people. And unfortunately, institutions are following this kind of protocol to collapse ethnic studies units across the board, ethnic studies and gender studies units. And I think we are in a very scary time. But I also think just knowing the nature, and I am going to broaden and say ethnic studies, because I think it's not just Black studies that is under this microscope. Thankfully, from what we know about these pasts and these histories and these fields is, I just came from DC, as you know, being in DC for 10 weeks. And I always use the example, you can't mute DC, you can't mute go-go music. I feel like that about Black studies. You can't mute this discipline. You can't mute this tradition. That is absolutely what this entire tradition is about, is the fact that, despite all, Black studies is still here. You know, Black people, diasporic people, foundational Black Americans, they are still here. And as long as there is a people and then a student body that is craving this knowledge, at some point, I in my mind, I imagine that if there are new presidencies to come, that a lot of the university scrutiny for these departments will kind of minimize and kind of step back and realize that these units in particular are really critical to humanities-based education. I mean, who is better to be a subject of a humanities course? I say that because I'm in humanities now, or social science course, but the people that were given the least and have produced the most.
Yeah. Thank you for that. There's so much in that. Very insightful set of comments, Jessica. I really appreciate that. And sort of thinking then about, and I love know the footnotes. I was going to adopt this phrase.
You got to know the footnotes. You're going to embarrass yourself if you don't know the footnotes.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. the way I can barely catch my breath, I agree so much with that. So I really love that way of putting it, and that's inheriting a legacy of really astute scholarship and observation. So thank you for that. And so thinking about, you've talked about, it's important to know these sort of canonical texts, fields, trends inside of Black studies. I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit about your research. You've given, I think, really nice characterization of it in terms of your historical sensibilities, your interest in archives and Black women. And I'm interested how you think your research fits in that tradition of Black studies, but also what boundaries do you think it pushes, or what new horizons do you think it opens up?
Thanks. That's a great question. I think at the core, I've always been interested in questions of freedom and justice, even though I'm a slavery scholar. So I don't want to say that I'm a scholar of free Black life. That actually is not how I'd qualify myself, even though freedom ends up in all kinds of titles. I'm definitely a scholar of slavery. I'm a scholar of the enslaved women's experience. And again, finding this way out of no way, going from the margins to the center. I've been very vested in, kind of this wave of scholars that is thinking about new and exciting ways to talk about the Black woman's experience. And, we're now into the second, third. I've done this calculation. We're almost in the third or fourth generation of Black women scholars in particular producing other Black women scholars, which is such a rarity. I don't think people realize what a rarity that is. So where do I find myself in my work? I find myself really traditionally as a scholar of early America. I love early America. I love the American Revolution and all the contradictions. I that is kind of my jam. The American Revolution, what it promised, what it did not promise people of African descent, and how we nonetheless said, "Mm-mm. We are either going to join the British, we're going to try and pick up arms, we are going to write petitions, we're going to run away." So there is, that is kind of where I see myself now. And certainly my first book, Finding Charity's Folks, was supposed to be a study of the American Revolution and slave life in Maryland, Baltimore in particular. In the book, I tell the story about how this woman, Charity Folks, just kind of started appearing in a few records, and I was kind of prompted to learn more about her story. People would say, "Wouldn't it be great if you found more on her story?" And, there wasn't any more on her story. And at some point, I decided to do what's I need to be careful how I say this. I decided to step outside the traditional archive, the state archives of Maryland, and I want to speak to genealogists and family historians who are also archive preservers and builders. And I was able to put a story together of this woman and her family, even down to the present moment where I've interacted with some of her descendants, and they are mounting campaigns in the city of Annapolis, where she's from, to have her memorialized in ways that were unheard of for 200 odd years. So the question was the boundaries in my own work. As a scholar, I do think I'm a career learner. A close friend called me enterprising. I said, "What does that mean?" I do not make money at this profession. I've tried to be enterprising. Like, what does enterprising mean to you?
That's funny.
And they said, enterprising is remaking models, thinking of new ways, new innovative ways. I said, "Oh, okay. So entrepreneur and enterprising." I conflated the two because I think they should be related. Um, but I definitely encourage students to think about ways that they are building histories through social media, through digital humanities. There's a school of thought where digital humanists, you have Jessica Marie Johnson, trained at College Park and right up the street from you. Jessica Marie Johnson showing us how we understood things being categorized has always been racialized, has always been gendered. I don't necessarily think that I'm a Black digital humanities scholar in that way. I think that I'm much more interested in how people are now keeping the records and how they are going to, make a collection of this particular material.
Mhm.
So, for example, my colleague, Tiffany Willoughby Herrard, my colleagues, Tiffany Willoughby Herrard, LaShonda Carter, Lisa Beard, and then Nicole Floyd Alexander, we have a collection of oral histories that are coming out. Tiffany is a political scientist, and she wanted to do a conference on Black women political scientists at UC Irvine. This has nothing to do with me because I'm a historian, but in that moment, I was in charge of money from the UC Black Studies Consortium, which was a system-wide uh, uh, grant, and I can say this, I conspired with Aisha Finch so we could figure out how to get more money to this conference at UCI because we're at UC Irvine, so very conservative, so very anti-Black. And I have to think of when it was, 2013 to 2004 2015, I'm sorry. 2016? I should know this as a historian, and we've been working on the volume. Anyway, Tiffany and Lisa and LaShonda brought together, like, over 200 Black women political scientists, and
Hmm.
they had trained their undergrads to do oral histories. And, I am a history elitist. I'm like, "Ugh, no one can do oral histories, only historians can." But Tiffany trained her students, and now we have this incredible database we call the Black Women's Thriving Database, Black Feminist Thriving Database of, information about Black women scholars. There were a few historians sprinkled about, um, but I think that, this is not a traditional archive, but one day it will be housed in a traditional archive. So the questions they put together in their pen and paper scales, their oral history questions, their interview. See, I'm a historian. You can tell I don't even know what these terms are. Their interview procedures really opened up a way for Black women scholars to talk about their experience in the profession and with their research. So that's what I mean about I'm kind of pushing the boundaries and kind of figuring out where I fit in Black digital humanities,
Mhm.
um, and how I can help preserve records that might have gone unnoticed. Um, and then my most recent book that I'm working on and that I spent some time at College Park. Let me just go back and say something about University of Maryland College Park. I did research there as a grad student. I had moved to DC and I was in Silver Spring for 3 years, going back and forth to the Maryland Archives and to College Park and everything archive related. So I just spent some time at the Southern Freedmen's Bureau papers with your colleagues, and I'm interested in looking at Black women and domestic violence in these first few years after slavery, the first time they have legal control of their body, and what it looks like when they protested violence, violence within their home, violence perpetrated on their partners or violence they perpetrated on their partners. So I'm really invested right now in looking at the ways in which not just how violence permeated Black women's lives, but how they also survived it, and especially how they had to be very cunning when they went to Freedmen's Bureau agents and advocate for themselves.
Mhm.
If you fast forward to the modern times, the modern days, where you look at people like Marissa Alexander, who tried to protect herself by firing a warning shot to warn her abuser to stay away. The same in Florida, the same state where Zimmerman went free, Marissa ended up in prison, in jail for defending herself. So in this particular moment, I'm doing two things. I'm interested in how we're preserving information and how to best preserve it in thinking about the work of Jessica Marie Johnson or my colleague, Sharon Block, how terminology can always determine how information is seen and recorded, like the metadata. Will the metadata yield what we need it to yield? And I'm reluctant into getting into metadata and all this minutia. I'm very reluctant, but you need that in order to put an archive together. So that's one kind of strand of my research. The next strand is continuing this looking at freedom in intense moments of unfreedom. And freedom is wonderful, justice is even better. And as we know from the African American experience, justice is always hard fought, and sometimes justice isn't achieved, even if a ruling goes in our favor. And then the last thread, which brings me to this podcast, is clearly I don't have a problem with a microphone in front of me. Clearly, I don't have a problem speaking in front of a large crowd, but I it's not so secret now, but one of the ways I deal with kind of the demands of doing work on slavery and the horrifying examples I come across is I need something that is so completely different.
Mm.
And so reality television has been my way of escaping things until I realized, so many of the tropes we see and so many of the stereotypes we see in African American studies make its way into reality TV series, right?
Mhm.
I'm thinking of Bravo. A friend of mine, I will never forgive her, has me watching Love Island, and the way in which I see Black women in particular have to be depicted in order to get camera time is very interesting. I could go off on a whole tangent about that. But some graduate students of mine somehow sussed out. I must have had a moment between class where we started talking about Bravo. Next thing I know, they come to me and say, can we do an article on Bravo TV? No, but you can write your exams for the history department. When they,
Thank you.
but you can do that. When they were done with their exams, they came back and said, "Can we write an article?" I said, "Sure." And they came back and said, "Yeah, so we've been thinking about a podcast," and they had like a whole uh, vision for how to do a podcast. So we subsequently, and they are not African American, we subsequently did a podcast and then had an edited volume on reality television coming out of UNC. Um, and in some ways, because so many of the topics weren't necessarily about African American or African American women's history, it kind of allowed my spirit to do a reset.
Hmm.
I mean, we have some great episodes that deal with African Americans. We have some great people that contributed to the volume. Pulitzer Prize winning author Marcia Chatelain. We have NAACP winner Tanisha Ford. They initially did the podcast just because they like reality TV. And we just get the benefit of them being excellent scholars outside of, everything else. So I kind of have three trajectories that I'm going on right now. And that's thinking about how to preserve history, writing about history, and then also teaching future generations. I guess I should say Black Studies, right? Because it's the Black Studies podcast. Using the foundation of Black Studies to tell stories.
You can use all the
Um,
cognates.
yeah, to document, to tell stories, and then teaching the next generation, right? We all should be in the process of teaching the next generation how to do Black studies or Black history in innovative but very culturally responsible ways, right? I think that there's always an ethics involved in doing any kind of history with not just with living people in general. I mean, as a social historian, I think that there is always going to be an ethics involved whenever you do any kind of research related to people. And that's true for Black studies as well. There's a way in which um, if you don't hold yourself responsible for how you're telling the stories, the academic community will, your Black studies scholars will,
Mhm.
your students will. So that's kind of my three main trajectories in terms of how it relates to Black studies. That was a long roundabout answer. But again, I warned you, don't put a microphone in front of me.
It was
That's your
not.
problem with editing. That's your editing. That's your purview as an editor. That's your job.
No, there's nothing roundabout at all. In fact, it was very rich and textured and detailed. I really appreciate that. So there's so much that's interesting there about, it's it kind of, I heard so much, especially in this last bit of how you started your sort of autobiographical reflections and the movement from history to core faculty in Black Studies at Irvine, which was, there's something about the intellectual expansiveness that you needed. And so you've sort of narrated very concretely there exactly what that expansiveness makes possible, that pivot in a hallway, in a conversation, to a different kind of research that nevertheless is intimately connected to the kind of stuff you're already doing. And I cannot even begin to tell you how much I love that you said, well, first pass your exams.
I mean, pass your
Yeah, no,
exams.
that thrilled me. So thank you for saying it.
I mean, pass your exams before you don't even get me started on social media.
But
Pass your exams.
absolutely, yes. So let me let me shift then to the last two questions that I had for you. The first one, thinking about the history and future of Black studies, what do you think the field has done well, and what do you think it has not done particularly well?
In terms of what it's done well, the field itself is not just remained visible, but has been hyper visible. Black studies scholars are everywhere. It's almost like we have a seat at a lot of tables that people don't realize weren't always open to us. In terms of Black studies on scholars on editorial boards, Black studies with our own journals, Black studies on college campuses. Listen, Mark Lamont Hill, for whether you like him or do not like him, he has his own bookstore. You're in D.C., you know that, Haile Gerima has his own bookstore, the Sankofa bookstore.
Mm-hmm.
We need to have bookstores so that people in the community can read what we're doing, right? So I think that one of the things that Black Studies has done well is it's been so expansive and so explosive, and we've taken these rare moments that the capital they have given us to tell our story. The African American History Museum on the Mall started over 100 years ago. It started in the beginning of the 20th century when Black people, former slaves, arrived and said in D.C. and said, "We want our story told." Look how long it took to get that museum. So what we've done well is really in the moments that we can expand, we've expanded voraciously, and always though with a level of attention to detail and history and the past, and have made Black studies motivational. I think we've done that very well. I think gendered nuances we have done very well. Complicating the narrative, the argument between diaspora and foundational Black Americans, I think we're just in the beginning of that articulation. I have always considered myself a diaspora scholar. When I got hired for this job at Irvine, they were looking specifically for a 19th century scholar of slavery. Okay, but that still can be diaspora as well. So I kind of don't win points in the diaspora war conversations because I think all the experiences are right, and everyone believes they're right. So I think that we're just beginning to, even though this has been a standard question, I think we're just beginning to tease out how that plays out, both in the profession, in the scholarship, and then understanding how it's played out in communities. And training new generations of scholars, I think we've done very well. I also think we've done very well getting into the mainstream. I know I just talked about people who do trade presses, but look at the story of Ona Judge. Look at the story of Erica Armstrong Dunbar, and the way in which she wrote about early American women, Black women in Philadelphia, and and now she's been finalist for major book prizes. People know Ona Judge's name. This is the enslaved woman who ran away from George Washington and was never caught. That's the name of the book, Never Caught. Now there's a mural representing Ona Judge on the side of a building in Philadelphia during this presidency. Is quite remarkable. So I also think that we're in this moment where we've I don't want to say infiltrated the common sphere because we've always been there, but it's now Black studies scholars who are writing these narratives, right? Some of the things I think that we have not done well, and here's where I come to my social media comments. I firmly believe that grad students do not need to be on social media until after their dissertation. But I've also been told that I'm wrong about that because there's all kinds of things that didn't exist when I was a grad student. It's like the Wiki job board where you can find out who's being interviewed, what schools are looking for. I've also seen...
I cannot imagine.
It's terror.
On
could you imagine the anxiety?
No, it gives me too much anxiety, and I ain't been on the job market for like 30 years. So,
right. You know, in our day, you just happened to find out who was interviewing for that job because you passed someone coming in and out of the interview room. I can't imagine going to a wiki and then they say, oh, they've already interviewed 3 people. They gave the offer to so-and-so. What?
Wow.
It's a little too public. I think what we've done, we haven't kept some things that should be discreet. Again, the younger generations will disagree with me. I also think that we're in this moment where social media can raise your profile as a scholar, which is great, but sometimes people don't realize the scholarship also has to be good.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's all I'm going to say. That, as they would say on Threads, no explanation needed. So that's what I think we haven't done particularly well, is conveying to this younger generation. Or maybe that's not even true. Maybe because I know some old school people, they're like, yeah, don't do that. But people are coming into this moment of incredible expansiveness and explosion of Black studies and thinking that everyone can be the next big thing. Not everyone can be the next big thing. All you can do, and to borrow from Toni Morrison, all you can do is be your best thing.
I like that. Again, that's another thing I'm going to adopt going forward. I really like that way of be your best thing. Yeah, I think the social media and young scholars is, I think it's become mythically a place where people imagine you make your career, but I don't think that's ever true. I think, you can get a couple of invites and, that's great and fun because people get excited about you tweeting about your work. But in the end, I don't know how much people read these days. I have my skepticism, but when they do read, people do take note of the quality of the scholarship, and that in the end is how you end up, part of how you end up where you end up in your career. There's also just no jobs, and so there's always that part of,
there's no job.
That's why the wiki job thing, I mean, it gives me such a pit in my stomach when it comes up, and I'm not even on the job market. But there's a kind of moment by moment emotional cruelty that, our generation, we had to put it off for that moment of, walking across the quad and somebody says, "Did you hear?" Right. I don't know. I prefer that, but like you said,
I prefer that too. The few times I've gone to look for other jobs, I don't even know if I know how to use the wiki. Can I say one more thing about Black studies? And it's kind of a double rub. And what some people manage to do, because we talked about this, is they believe there's an eventual monetization of this academic work that we do. That's not necessarily true. There's some things, and I've had to ask some of my own mentors, someone invited me to do this. Is this where I give them my fee scale? And they say, no, some things you have to do for free because it could lead to X, Y, and Z. Or some of things you do for free because it's due diligence, giving back to the community. This issue about monetization, I think, is both good and bad. It's a great model if you're on the end that can monetize. It's a really overwhelming model if you don't know how to get an agent or you don't know how to get a publicist. You aren't necessarily someone who knows how to monetize. So I think that aspect of Black studies right now, we need to think about. We need to think about a little bit more.
And I, just to add to that, because I had lots of thoughts on this, I won't turn it into the John Drabinski rant about this. Because, I don't have a problem with people getting, whatever honorarium for talks and so forth. But one of the things about the intensification of monetization is, I think there's a sense there's a real question for me about how it diminishes us quietly in terms of our spiritual relationship to the kind of work we do in the communities we belong to as scholars, but also the institutional privileges that ends up reifying. I don't think anybody is undertaking that thinking about elitism, but there are only certain universities that can pay you $1,500 for giving a talk, and most can pay very, very little, right? And also, for me, look, so many things in academia operate at a massive loss. And so there are no pots of money. I say this all the time. There are no pots of money waiting around the corner that somebody else is getting. You can always ask, but don't be surprised when they say, we run in the red every year, which is what my department does. So, while at the same time being a place that has actual resources compared to many, many, many places. But well, let me ask you this last question then. And I think you've probably touched on many different kinds of responses. So I'm interested to hear what you have to say about this, which is thinking in a Black Studies context, what is the question you would want us to be asking or the issue you would want us to all be thinking about?
I have to go back to money. This isn't my answer to the question. Let me just co-sign with you. As a scholar of slavery, I think we should all get paid. And I think, but we also, just because a school can't give you $1,500 or even $5,000 doesn't mean that you don't do a talk at that school. One of the things I like about some scholars is that they say, this is the fee, but let's work somewhere in between. So let me also just say that I absolutely think we should get paid, but I also think we should, be a little flexible. Okay, so the question is, what is the question? Sorry, I had to go back to money for a minute.
You would want to? Yeah, no. As somebody who never gets invited anywhere, I'm always baffled at these scales sometimes. But no. But my question was, what's the question you would want us to all be thinking about, or the issue you would want us to all be thinking about in a Black Studies context?
So when I teach my comparative slave rebellion class, I always use "Redemption Song" by Bob Marley. Because here he starts with, in the belly of a slave ship, and by the end he's asking people to help him sing about, other world events that are happening. And so I would want people, in terms of Black studies and some kind of the big questions, to remember that there's always a relationship between like freedom and justice, like I've talked about, and intense, horrific, unimaginable moments and moments of survival. But I use Redemption Song, and I always say that it's a song, it's a lament, as in a prayer of deep mourning, of deep sorrow, but also a prayer that is literally calling on the powers that be for some kind of assistance. And ultimately, it's a call to action. And I think that is how I see Black Studies. Black Studies is a discipline. Depending on the story you're writing about, it is a story of it's a lament. It's a prayer of surpassing great grief or mourning. It's also a prayer, because you can't do Black Studies and Black people without doing some kind of spiritual work. It's a prayer that joy will find the subjects we write about or the story we're writing about. And then ultimately, Black Studies now and how it was first conceived should be a call to action. It should be a tool of liberation.
I love that. What a wonderful place to wrap up. And I think Marley is an endless source of theory and politics. And so I love that his name comes up here at the end. So thank you for that. But thank you for all of this, Jessica. I appreciate your time. But this has been a really thoughtful, insightful, and really compelling conversation. And it's a really excellent contribution to the series. Thank you so much for that.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you for having me. And thank you for everyone who listened, as I'm waving my hands like they can see me.
put that in the text, waved hands at the end.
Wave hands, gave the peace sign. But thank you for having me.
Well, you have a great rest of your day, all right?
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.